objectivity of the law, hence the lowering of the pretensions of moral self-esteem, that is, humiliation on the sensible side, is an elevation of the moral, it is, practical esteem for the law itself on the intellectual side. In a word, it is respect for the law, and therefore, as its cause is intellectual, a positive feeling which can be known a priori. For whatever diminishes the obstacles to an activity furthers this activity itself. Now, the recognition of the moral law is a consciousness of an activity of practical reason from objective principles, which only fails to reveal its effect in actions because subjective, pathological causes hinder it. Respect for the moral law, then, must be regarded as a positive, though indirect effect of it on feeling, inasmuch as this respect weakens the impeding influence of inclinations by humiliating self-esteem, and hence also as a subjective principle of activity, that is, as a motive to obedience to the law, and as a principle of the maxims of life conformable to it. From the notion of motive arises that of an interest, which can never be attributed to any being unless it possesses reason, and which signifies a motive of the will in so far as it is conceived by the reason. Since in a morally good will the law itself must be the motive, the moral interest is a pure interest of practical reason alone, independent of sense. On the notion of an interest is based that of a maxim. This, therefore, is morally good only in case it rests simply on the interest taken in obedience to the law. All three notions, however, that of a motive, of an interest, and of a maxim, can be applied only to finite beings. For they all suppose the limitation of the nature of the being, and that the subjective character of his choice does not of itself agree with the objective law of a practical reason. They suppose that the being requires to be impelled to action by something, because an internal obstacle opposes itself. Therefore they cannot be applied to the divine will. There is something so singular in the unbounded esteem for the pure moral law, apart from all advantage, as it is presented for our obedience by practical reason, the voice of which makes even the boldest sinner tremble and compels him to hide himself from it, that we cannot wonder if we find this influence of a mere intellectual idea on the feelings quite incomprehensible to speculative reason, and have to be satisfied with seeing so much of this a priori that such a feeling is inseparably connected with the conception of the moral law in every finite rational being. If this feeling of respect were pathological, and therefore were a feeling of pleasure based on the inner sense, it would be in vain to try to discover a connection of it with any idea a priori. But it is a feeling that applies merely to what is practical, and depends on the conception of a law simply as to its form, not on account of any object, and therefore cannot be reckoned either as pleasure or pain, and yet produces an interest in obedience to the law which we call the moral interest, just as the capacity of taking such an interest in the law, or respect for the moral law itself, is properly the moral feeling. The consciousness of a free submission of the will to the law, yet combined with an inevitable constraint put upon all inclinations, though only by our own reason, is respect for the law. The law that demands this respect and inspires it is clearly no other than the moral, for no other precludes all inclinations from exercising any direct influence on the will. An action which is objectively practical according to this law, to the exclusion of every determining principle of inclination, is duty, and this by reason of that exclusion includes in its concept practical obligation, that is, a determination to actions, however reluctantly they may be done. The feeling that arises from the consciousness of this obligation is not pathological, as would be a feeling produced by an object of the senses, but practical only, that is, it is made possible by a preceding objective determination of the will and a causality of the reason. A submission to the law, therefore, that is, as a command, announcing constraint for the sensibly affected subject, it contains in it no pleasure, but on the contrary, so far, pain in the action. On the other hand, however, as its constraint is exercised merely by legislation of our own reason, it also contains something elevating, and this subjective effect on feeling, inasmuch as pure practical reason is the sole cause of it, may be called in this respect self-approbation, since we recognize ourselves as determined thereto solely by the law without any interest, and are now conscious of a quite different interest subjectively produced thereby, and which is purely practical and free. And our taking this interest in an action of duty is not suggested by any inclination, but is commanded and actually brought about by reason through the practical law, whence this feeling obtains a special name, that of respect. The notion of duty, therefore, requires in the action objectively agreement with the law, and subjectively in its maxim, that respect for the law shall be the sole mode in which the will is determined thereby. And on this rests the distinction between the consciousness of having acted according to duty and from duty, that is, from respect for the law. The former, legality, is possible even if inclinations have been the determining principles of the will, but the latter, morality, moral worth, can be placed only in this, that the action is done from duty, that is, simply for the sake of the law. If we examine accurately the notion of respect for persons as it has been already laid down, we shall perceive that it always rests on the consciousness of a duty which an example shows us, and that respect, therefore, can never have any but a moral ground, that it is very good and even, in a psychological point of view, very useful for the knowledge of mankind, that whenever we use this expression we should attend to the secret and marvellous, yet often recurring regard which men in their judgment pay to the moral law. It is of the greatest importance to attend with the utmost exactness in all moral judgments to the subjective principle of all maxims, that all the morality of actions may be placed in the necessity of acting from duty and from respect for the law, not from love and inclination for that which the actions are to produce. For men and all created rational beings, moral necessity is constraint, that is, obligation, and every action based on it is to be conceived as a duty, not as a proceeding previously pleasing or likely to be pleasing to us of our own accord, as if indeed we could ever bring it about, that without respect for the law, which implies fear, or at least apprehension of transgression, we of ourselves, like the independent deity, could ever come into possession of holiness of will by the coincidence of our will with the pure moral law becoming as it were part of our nature, never to be shaken, in which case the law would cease to be a command for us, as we could never be tempted to be untrue to it. The moral law is in fact for the will of a perfect being a law of holiness, but for the will of every finite rational being a law of duty, of moral constraint, and of the determination of its actions by respect for this law and reverence for its duty. No other subjective principle must be assumed as motive, else while the action might chance to be such as law prescribes, yet as does not proceed from duty, the intention, which is the thing properly in question in this legislation, is not moral. It is a very beautiful thing to do good to men from love to them and from sympathetic good will, or to be just from love of order. But this is not yet the true moral maxim of our conduct, which is suitable to our position amongst rational beings as men, when we pretend with fanciful pride to set ourselves above the thought of duty, like volunteers, and as if we were independent on the command, to want to do of our own good pleasure what we think we need no command to do. We stand under a discipline of reason, and in all our maxims must not forget our subjection to it, nor withdraw anything therefrom, or by an egotistic presumption diminish aught of the authority of the law, although our own reason gives it, so as to set the determining principle of our will, even though the law be conformed to, anywhere else but in the law itself and in respect for this law. Duty and obligation are the only names that we must give to our relation to the moral law. We are indeed legislative members of a moral kingdom